Welcome to the Watson Farley Williams webinar series, The Anatomy of an LNG to Power Project. This is episode 2, LNG to Power in Vietnam. My name is Nick Dingemans and I'm a corporate partner based in Singapore. Before I start, a number of housekeeping matters. Please note all your microphones and cameras have been switched off centrally. Please keep them switched off throughout the presentation. For the Q&A, please submit your questions throughout the presentation through the chat function, and we'll have time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. This webinar is being recorded. The recording and the slides will be made available to everyone who's registered for the webinar. For this episode, I'm joined by my colleagues Linda, Matt Lorimer, and Heike Trishman. Lynn is the head of our Hanoi office and splits her time between Hong Kong and Hanoi. Matt is a partner in our Hanoi office and is currently in London due to COVID. Heike is based in our London office. As you can see from the agenda, we will put the Vietnamese LNG to power market into the global context, and we'll look at the legal and regulatory framework in Vietnam, the methods and options available for the design, construction and operation of an LNG to power project in Vietnam. Lynn will talk you through the anatomy of LNG to power in Vietnam, looking at the legal and regulatory framework, the corporate structures and the contracting strategies, and Matt will look at the contractual risk matrix inherent in constructing LNG to power. Later this year, we're planning further webinars where we'll take a deeper dive into issues surrounding the procurement and financing of FSRUs and power plants. Before I hand over to Matt and Lynn to get the anatomy in Vietnam, Heike and I will take a brief look at the evolution of LNG to power globally and how that impacts Vietnam. As you can see, this is the LNG to power value chain. This is obviously a simplified version, starting at the upstream, ending with the end users of the power. We've included most of the market participants, starting with host governments at the upstream, gas producers, all the way down to generation companies and power off-takers. In this webinar, we're going to concentrate particularly on the downstream portion from the regasification of imported LNG through to the provision of power to end users. As the world transitions to net zero, I think LNG will be a key component of that transition. As BP indicated in their 2020 statistical review, coal remains a dominant energy source in the generation of electricity. This is particularly so in countries like Vietnam in Southeast Asia. Natural gas and LNG will play an important part in the transition to net zero by displacing coal and enabling countries to transition. Studies are currently underway in the UK, Germany and other jurisdictions to look at how existing gas infrastructure might be used with hydrogen. In the future, if natural gas can be blended with hydrogen or whole systems handed over to hydrogen, we can move to net zero more quickly. Alternatively, natural gas may be displaced by synthetic gas produced from biosources. With this research and the clear benefit of moving away from coal, we see that LNG to power will be an important feature of the next 30 years as the world moves towards net zero. In the nearly 20 years since the first floating regas storage units were commissioned, the LNG sector has evolved from the traditional point-to-point system to a dynamic market with integrated components and new participants. This has resulted in a deeper market. This new market is created by the new contracting models that LNG aggregators and traders have been creating to allow greater availability and greater flexibility in the market. This in turn is changing the supply-demand profile for buyers, allowing them a mix of portfolio contracting with spot, short-term, medium-term and long-term options. When this is added to the floating modular construction that is inherent in an FSRU, or indeed in the upstream in floating LNG, and again in power barges and in even floating desalination, new buyers and new markets become available for these aggregators. This in turn is changing the pricing models available and ultimately leading to the commoditization of LNG. I'm now going to hand over to Heike to talk more about LNG demand and pricing indicators. Heike.
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everybody. This slide is something we showed in episode 1, and as discussed in much more detail there, the LNG market and with it the LNG value chain have been and are constantly changing. Once upon a time, as they say, sellers were able to rely on creditworthy so-called anchor buyers or countries, that is the A to B supply chain really, that had an impeccable payment history and ensured steady demand for LNG, and that were willing to pay for the LNG according to a price formula that was pretty much regionally entrenched due to the market at that time being sliced up into Asia Pacific and Atlantic basins mainly. That is, producers in Asia would only sell to buyers in the same region, and the same was true for sellers in the Atlantic basin, for example, in West and North Africa, who would mostly sell into Europe. And there was virtually no interference between these regions. However, the emergence of swing suppliers in the Middle East, like the Qataris, and later on the low-cost swing producers in the US, as well as large portfolio players, which Nick already mentioned, all of whom could now sell east and west, thanks to either their location and or thanks to the Suez and now the Panama Canals having opened up to LNG trade. And all of that eroded this traditional model and introduced much greater competition for traditional producers, but also much more choice and flexibility for buyers. And obviously that is on top of what Nick has already mentioned. So that flexibility is not just in terms of LNG volumes, but also pricing formulas and competing fuel indexation. The best example perhaps is the amount of LNG currently being sold in Asia, or recently being sold in Asia, that is indexed to Henry Hub rather than the traditional Japanese crude cocktail. So Henry Hub being obviously the American gas indexation, which is nowhere near the Asia Pacific basin. Some of the terms that have been and are being affected by this are set out in this slide. So this so-called buyer's market, that is buyers having a lot of choice and sellers being quite squeezed, I'd say, is also helped by current supply outstripping demand due to COVID and obviously generally a worldwide economic decline, but also the emergence or existence of competing fuels like domestic or at least cheaper coal, nuclear energy and renewables energy. Buyers' market conditions are forecast to be exacerbated by the upcoming expiration of long-term contracts in Asia, especially Japan and South Korea, which will free up further uncommitted quantities, and that can be seen in the graph in this slide. These conditions may tighten again, of course, and when demand starts to overtake supply. But for now, I think it is a good time for new LNG buyers, particularly those who are sometimes perhaps just perceived to be credit worthy and in politically stable, high energy demand jurisdictions, such as Vietnam, which is obviously why we're talking about this today. So over to Matt.
Thanks, Heike. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for those in Asia. I think the very high level of interest we've had in this webinar. Sorry, just a small technical difficulty. I think the high level of interest we've had in this webinar means that I don't need to say too much to convince you that the LNG to power market in Vietnam offers interesting opportunities for both domestic and international investors. It's no secret that Vietnam has a very high demand for power, and as the world moves away from coal, gas will play a very important part in this. As you can see from this slide, over the next several years, the domestic production of gas in Vietnam is expected to increase significantly, but there is still a shortfall and LNG will play an important role in plugging that gap. And LNG can also be used as a backup fuel for projects fired by domestic gas. Accordingly, as set out in the next slide, there are already a number of LNG to, can we move on to the next slide, please? Accordingly, as set out in this next slide, there are already a number of LNG to power projects that have already been approved in Vietnam. And I would point out at this stage that for reasons of confidentiality, all the information we've included in this presentation about particular projects is based on publicly available sources and is used just for illustrative purposes. In addition to the demand for power, Vietnam already has structures in place for developing and financing coal-fired power projects that have been successfully accepted by international investors and sponsors. And given that at the current moment, no LNG to power project has been completed in Vietnam, and given that both investors and lenders have a high favorability to use already tested structures, we believe that the structures that have been developed for coal-fired power plants in Vietnam can form a useful starting point for people looking to structure LNG to power projects in Vietnam. And for this reason, in this presentation, as well as talking about the LNG to power legislation in Vietnam, we will also talk about some of the structures that have been successfully used for imported coal projects in Vietnam. And we will talk about some of the lessons that we have learned and highlight some of the key points for potential sponsors. As this slide shows, it gives a very high-level overview of some of the options for structuring. As Nick has pointed out, in an LNG project, there are a number of elements. There's the power project itself, and there's also the regasification facility. And these two projects can either be owned together by one sponsor or consortium of sponsors, or they can have separate ownership. In addition, each of the elements of the project can be developed under the BOT as a BOT project under the Vietnamese PPP law, or it can be developed as an independent power plant under the Vietnamese investment law. And it's also possible to have hybrids of these different structures. I will now hand over to my partner Lynn, who will talk in a bit more detail about some of these structures. As many of you will know, Lynn has been instrumental in developing these structures over the last several years and can talk with real authority about the situation in Vietnam. Lynn.
Thanks, Matt. Good afternoon. Hi, everybody. Actually, Matt already mentioned, but I just want to re-emphasize that the information on the several projects, LNG to power, that we present this afternoon are based on the public available information. The reason I emphasize because we secure our role in several of those projects, and it is not such circumstance that we disclose any privileged information for the purpose of this seminar. Next slide, please. Yes, so the next few slides, I'm going to introduce you to the legal framework for LNG to power in Vietnam. Yes, as you may know, investment in the infrastructure in Vietnam can be made in two ways. One is a BOT scheme under the PPP law and regulation, and the other is a general IPP, independent power plant, under the general investment law and the law on enterprises. Of course, PPP and BOT project can also refer to and enjoy the protection of the law on investment and the law on enterprises, but they have the special PPP regime that can be applied to them in particular. So I'm going to walk you through the key features or differences between the two schemes in Vietnam, because this is the first step for any investor who consider to make the investment in the LNG to power business. So the first feature is the applicable law, which I just mentioned to you, PPP and PPP law, which is the new PPP that issued by the National Assembly, number 64 last month, will become effective on 1st of January 2021. But currently, we have a Decree 63 that provides for the PPP projects. For IPP, then it's just a general investment law on the law on enterprises. For ownership structure, most of the power projects for PPP, normally we have the foreign owned companies. We can have some Vietnamese, but they just only own a minority shares in such projects. While in IPP, you can see that most of the owners in those projects are domestic, I mean, particularly EVN, PVN, Vinacomit, or local investor like Thăng Long projects. But recently for the LNG to gas power, there have been two foreign investors that were selected for IPP. One is Bạc Liêu, which we are going to talk about, and the other is Marubeni. One of the first steps for the differences between the PPP and IPP is the procedure to award investor, as well as the procedure to select project. So for PPP project, especially under the new PPP law, it's a quite complicated process. You can have either the Ministry of Planning Investment in Vietnam that prepare and propose the project to be awarded as a PPP, or investor may take the initiative to come up with the PPP law, the PPP project. However, such it doesn't mean that if the investor suggest a project, they will be awarded with that project. And also the PPP law requires a three-way of bidding process. You can have open bidding, you can have a competitive investment if you have only competitive negotiation if you have only 3 investors who are interested, or you can have appointment in special circumstances, for example, like for the purpose of the national security, or on a special due to the timeline. There's some exception that the Prime Minister can exempt such a requirement in case the bidding law cannot be applied. So for IPP, this is much simpler. The bidding process is not absolutely required. As long as the investor proposed project in the master plan, they can be awarded by the Prime Minister. Next, one of the other features, differences between the PPP and IPP are the licensing. So for licensing, as you know, that for the PPP, investment registration certificate is not required, because you only have to go through a very complicated process for approval of the investor and the project. Therefore, after the investor is awarded the project, they can apply for the enterprise registration certificate, or we call ERC, at any time. And this should be a very straightforward procedure. It normally takes 5 to 10 days to set up the company. For IPP, it's different. You have to go through the same as any invested enterprise in Vietnam. You have to apply for the IRC, and thereafter then you apply for the ERC. But the most time-consuming exercise for the PPP project is the negotiation of the BOT project, BOT contract, or the concession agreement, and the government guarantee and undertaking with the authorized state body and the government. And this, the authorized state body would act as a chair to collect all the consents and comments from various agencies. So basically, you have to negotiate your contract on the risk allocation with all of the Vietnam side, including Ministry of Planning Investment, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Justice. Why IPP, you don't have this concession agreement, so you don't need to enter into any project document with the Vietnam side, except the PPA, which I talk about next. For the PPA, which is called Power Purchase Agreement, as actually in the next few slides, you can see that is one of the key important documents for the energy to power. For PPP projects, this is you have a very comprehensive bankable PPA. Especially, you already have a lot of good precedent for the imported coal projects, where you have a very clear take or pay for power and take or pay for fuel. In case of coal, or in this case energy. why it can be governed by foreign law, although the new law on PPP would put a new question on that. But while the IPP, then you have to comply with the template by event, and actually the template is compulsory by under the Circular 56 by the Ministry of Industry and Trade. So this template is not the same kind of bankable PPA that you can see in the PPP projects, but they are more or less just only for domestic market. It's usually maybe 20 to 30 pages, and it's a temporary in this circumstance, because when the merchant market in Vietnam comes into place, then all of these projects are expected that they have to participate into the merchant market. So they would not have the PPA anymore. Another feature is the protection on the foreign currency. So for PPP project, then you have the full foreign currency regime. Actually, it would not automatic all projects that once you are PPP, you have the foreign currency regime. The investor have to apply, but in most cases they would be they are able to obtain this foreign currency regime. And the foreign currency regime, what would they do? I think there are two things. One is about the protection on the foreign currency availability, the foreign exchange rate stability, and the remittance for the investor to repay to lenders, as well as to repatriate to the foreign investor. And another features for the foreign currency regime is about other special protection and assumption. For example, all transactions in Vietnam between two entities must be made in Vietnamese dong. So the tariff should be denominated and made in dong. But in the PPP projects, it can be exempted that the tariff can be denominated in US dollars and is only paid in dong on the monthly basis using the exchange rate on the payment date. And then the government on top of that would guarantee a certain percentage of such revenue to be converted into US dollars using the same exchange rate as the payment date by EVN. On the financing, it's also quite differences between the two. Most of the PPP BOT projects are normally financed under the non-recourse project finance, and the ECA like JBIC, KSIM, KSURE, they are very, very familiar with this. All the PPP, PPA, as well as the concession agreement, the GGU, the FCR. While the IPP, most of the projects so far, they normally secure project on corporate finance. Actually, many of them have ECA coverage, but the ECA coverage most rely on the previously Ministry of Finance guarantee, loan guarantee. However, over the last few years, the MOF no longer issue this guarantee. So now it will be more difficult for Vietnamese companies, especially like a company like Vinacobin, for example, to secure finance for large power projects having the ECA coverage. The risk allocation I mentioned earlier, actually you have beside the take or pay for power and take or pay for LNG, because the investor had to sign the concession agreement or the BOT contract with the government. So you have a lot of other protection. For example, government authorizations, the government would guarantee that you would obtain certain all the material government authorization on time, because if you fail to do that, although we already have to comply with the law and apply those licenses, it would be considered as a government event, and then you trigger all other protection you have. And with all of this, you don't have in the IBP scheme. That was one example. Another is a change in law. I mean, for change in law, if any change in law in the future, then you can have the compensation by the government, either by way of increase of tariff or extension of the term, or combination of both. For IPP, then you don't have the same protection, but you can rely on the general investment law that the law should not be retroactive, except in certain cases of like environment or national security. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the next slide, I'm going to just explain the key features on the legal framework that you have for the law on for LNG to power. So we have a two set of law that we need to pay attention. One is the law on petroleum that procure all of the procurement of the LNG, and the other is a law on electricity, which is the main law because you are running a power plant here, so you have to comply with the law on electricity. So those two set of law are important in a few circumstances. The first step is about the master plan, because you need to have the project must be in the master plan first, and then from the master plan, then you would build in, whether it's FSRU or it's an onshore terminal. And then you have a decision 63, circular 45 is all about the more applicable to the IPP, which is about the merchant market in the future. And then on the long petroleum, you have we have the master plan. Then you have a decree 87 on the provision of the gas and business. And then you have a circular 56, which I mentioned earlier. Also, we apply more for IPP, which is it is issue with the templates of the PPA. Next slide, please. One important legal framework that we need to pay attention is FSRU. I mean, one of the, as my partner Nick mentioned earlier, I mean, in order for the energy power project to operate, you need to have either the FSRU or the onshore terminal. So some projects that we have worked on in Vietnam propose FSRU, which is can be considered as a maybe more flexible and more economic. So for the legal framework of the FSRU, the interesting bits is unlike some countries like Indonesia or other countries, we do not have really the foreign ownership restriction on the FSRU. So foreign vessel may be able to enter into the Vietnamese port, provided that they subject to various licenses and the port access restriction that we mentioned in this slide. I think you can refer, we put it quite detailed, but basically the FSRU owner must have the certificate for eligibility of gas business, and you have to register your vessel. You have to comply with all the technical maritime safety, security. You have to comply with all the pollution, environmental pollution, and the certificate of insurance for server liability of the vessel. On the port assets, it's important that the FSRU or the power owner, they have to apply for the designated areas so that the FSRU can only be moored and operate within that area. And then based on that area, you would build in the gas pipeline from the FSRU to the power plant or the power generation center. And then the installation of the equipment, the handling of storage must also comply with all the technical safety procedure. But I think we need to note that because the FSRU is in Vietnam is still underdeveloped, or it has not successfully developed yet. So I think it's still in the developing process. So we expect that there will be some more regulation to be issued in the near future. Next slide, please. So this is just an overview of the slide on how the energy to power project works. So you would have it's quite similar to imported coal, if you are familiar with. So we have you have the transportation of the LNG from a foreign country to Vietnam, and then it will end up either in the FSRU or in the onshore terminal. Then you have the regasification, and then you transfer that gas to the power generation company, and then make power and sell to EVN. So that was a general view for all projects, and then based on that, then you can have a different kind of structure. Next slide, please. So we have two types of structure we talk about. One is a corporate structure, the other is contract structure, and then it can be mix and match depending on the circumstance in the project. So for the corporate structure, we can have three ways. One is integrated, another is standalone, and the third is a hybrid, is cross ownership. And interesting, you know, in Vietnam, so far we only have a few LNG projects that have been approved, but they actually, all of them, each of them have a different kind of corporate structure that can fit into this slide. For example, like the integrated structure is like the Bạc Liêu project, where the project company owns a power plant and also control the whole process, can own the FSRU and the entire value chain. The next standalone is like the Sơn Viet one by the consortium led by EDF, and is they only interested in the power plant. EDF is not interested in the FSRU, so the ownership is only the power plant. The FSRU, actually the first Sơn Viet one, they don't use FSRU. It's in the Sơn Viet area, so it's actually PVN, PV gas, and AS that own the terminal, but that have no relationship with the power company. So that was standalone corporate structure. And the third, the cost ownership, is like Sơn Viet 2, where, you know, AES is the 100% owner of the power plant, but they also have a 33% owner in the onshore terminal. Next slide, please. So this is a contract structure. Same thing, the integrated is very similar to the ownership structure. So the power plant, they, instead of own the FSRU, they control by contract, like the charter of the FSRU. And they all have the whole process. So actually, in this case, the most important third-party document that lenders or third party buy-in to look at is a PPA with EVN, because you can only see that is only the power with the end user, because the rest of the change are controlled by the power company. The next is back-to-back. So the back-to-back is one company from the power plant to the gas to the power plant to EVN. Each is different contract. So this will be more complicated in a way that we always have to, the lawyers have to check and make sure that, you know, it's only back-to-back, is always passed through to the next. So the power company would have the minimum risk. And the third is a tolling. Tolling is similar like in the Sơn Viet 1 project in the previous slide. So the power company own the power plant, and they actually own the LNG, but they only use the onshore terminal for tolling, for conversion of gas. But they all the time they own that energy, so they just have to pay the tolling fee. Next slide, please. So just by showing the chart, which is the easier illustration for you to see. You see this is a case study Sơn Viet 1. Which I mentioned earlier. For the corporate structure, it is a standalone, and for the contract structure, it's a tolling. So you can see here, that is you have the power company, then you LNG supply, then you go through the Sơn Viet regas terminal, and then convert it into gas, go to the power plant, and power plant sell it to EVN. So you can see that the LNG conversion to tolling agreement. I mean, this guy we put PVN, but it could be the consortium of PVN, PV gas, and AES. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. The next slide is the case study 2, which is Bạc Liêu, which is a typical integrated project. That it has all the, in this case is different from the Sơn Viet, that they don't use a terminal, but they have the FSRU. And in this slide you can see that we have two colors. Only one EVN is in blue, and the other energy supply, Bạc Liêu FSRU, Bạc Liêu EP, they are all controlled and owned by the power, by the consortium, by the sponsor of DOE. So this probably in a way that it can be more expensive, because the power plant, they have to take all the risk from the energy supply source to regasification, only sell to EVN. But we're going to talk how to minimize the risk and the price for this integrated structure. Next slide, please. So the next few slides, we will just share with you the lesson learned on the Vietnamese risk matrix, and I'm going to hand over to my partner, Matt, please.
Hi, thanks, Lynn. As Lynn says, in this section, we will highlight some of the key risks for an LNG project in Vietnam and highlight our experience acting on coal projects. As mentioned earlier, to date, there are no completed LNG projects in Vietnam. Therefore, we will talk about the risk matrix for imported coal projects and highlight some particular issues for LNG. If we move on to the next slide, this slide was originally included in our episode 1 webinar, and it sets out on the left some of the key risks that face an LNG project. The middle column sets out some of the common mitigants used globally, and we have now added a third column on the right, which sets out some issues which may be relevant in Vietnam. We've already touched on a number of these issues earlier in our presentation. Therefore, I'll not talk in detail on all these points, and will only highlight a few key areas for you. The first point I wanted to talk about was counterparty risk, especially in relation to the fuel supplier. We've seen in the context of imported coal that EVN is generally very reluctant to accept any responsibility for failure to perform by the fuel supplier, and this is therefore a risk for the project. It's therefore very important for the project to build in to their fuel supply agreements a lot of contractual mitigants, and we have seen this done successfully in Vietnam before. Just to give a few examples, some of these mitigants would be redirection of coal or LNG, the right to purchase from different fuel sources, and also including a project milestones which allow time to develop the necessary infrastructure, and having these backed up by liquidated damages and performance bonds, and having these timelines back to back with the timelines for completion of the power project agreed in the BOT contract. The next point I wanted to touch upon was the tariff. And as Lynn has explained, the BOT project was a very detailed PPA, and that PPA includes a tariff which includes an element known as the capacity charge, which is intended to compensate the investor for the costs of constructing the necessary infrastructure for the power plant. We believe that where there is an integrated power plant, where the regasification unit and the power plant are owned by one investor, it may be possible to include the infrastructure costs for the regasification unit into the capacity charge, though I would mention that this would be subject to negotiation with EVN, and the sponsor could expect EVN to request that they provide very detailed price breakdowns of how the costs are involved, and also set out a lot of detailed options to EVN, showing how different variations of the project can impact the price of the project and also the stability of supply. Alternatively, where an integrated project is considered too risky, it may be possible to set up a tolling structure where the power plant tolls the regasification of the LNG through a regasification unit owned by a Vietnamese state entity, and this element of the tariff could then, or this cost could be then passed into the tariff, and we think this might be a more simple solution to this issue. The next point I wanted to touch upon was market demand. As we've said, at the moment, the demand for power in Vietnam is very high, but most projects are financed on a long-term basis of at least 18 to 25 years, and it's not possible to predict how demand will change in the future. Lower energy demand, downward price pressure from other fuel sources, or a move to renewables could lower the demand for LNG in Vietnam. For a PPA project, for a BOT project, the documents The documents include a long-term take-or-pay obligation on EVN, which would mitigate this risk. But for IPP projects, we do not have these protections. However, on the upside, an IPP project would be able to benefit from lower prices in the future, and also from the possibility of the market becoming more liberal and the ability to sell on the wholesale competitive market in Vietnam. The next point I wanted to touch upon is on the next slide, if you could move over. As Lynn has mentioned, the project documents for a BOT project are currently governed by English law, although this may change when the new PPP law comes into force at the beginning of next year. It should be noted that in Vietnam, a court judgment in England is not enforceable. Therefore, most dispute resolution clauses specify dispute resolution at the SIAC in Singapore. Generally speaking, an SIAC arbitration award is considered enforceable in Vietnam. And it may be that international investors would still have some concerns about coming to Vietnam and trying to enforce an arbitration award against the Vietnamese government state-owned entity or the Vietnamese government. However, we believe that foreign investment in the power sector is a very important part of Vietnam's energy plans, and we believe this may encourage the Vietnamese government to recognise properly obtained foreign arbitration awards. The next point I wanted to just briefly highlight was taking security. And the lenders for any power project will require a comprehensive suite of security over all the assets of the project. In general, in Vietnam, foreign lenders cannot take security over land. However, there's an exception available for BOT projects, but not for IPP projects. For IPP projects looking to obtain financing from foreign lenders, you would have to look at alternative structures. One such structure may be obtaining a guarantee from a local Vietnamese bank who could then take back-to-back security over the project. But we would emphasize that this makes the financing a lot more complicated and would potentially involve a local Vietnamese bank who may not be familiar with project structures. The final point I wanted to talk about was permitting and licensing. Now, this is a point we didn't want to talk about in too much detail in this webinar. It's quite a technical subject and maybe not the most interesting one to talk about. In our experience, for both foreign and domestic investors, obtaining all the necessary licenses and permits in Vietnam can be very tricky. Even when you have a BOT contract with undertaking their own government authorizations, the investor will still need to deal with a number of different authorities in Vietnam who may take slightly differing approaches to the licenses, and this has to really be taken into account in the project timeline. A particular area of difficulty can be land use rights, as the land use rights for all elements of the project have to be negotiated with the relevant local authorities. This would apply for the land used for the power plant and also for the pipeline from the regasification unit to the power plant. And in particular, where residential land is used, the investor will need to agree a compensation package with the local government for the rehousing of the residents of the land. And this is frequently one of the most difficult and time-consuming elements of a project in Vietnam. Those were all of the key areas we wanted to highlight on the risk matrix. And I'll now hand back to Nick to discuss, for a panel session, to discuss some of the key points.
Thanks, Matt. Lynn and Heike, can you join us with your videos too, please?
Sure.
So thank you very much, Lynn and Matt, and to Heike. That was really, really interesting. We're just going to run through a number of questions I've got for the panel. The Q&A chat function, if you want to ask a question yourself, please submit it. I've got the chat function open on the side of my screen, so I'll keep an eye on that as we go through the panel, and we can move swiftly into your questions once I've tortured these guys with my questions. So Lynn, maybe you first. Clearly there's two models. There's the PPP BOT and the investment law IPP. If you were a foreign investor coming into Vietnam, where's the more logical way to go in terms of opting for a structure?
Hi, yeah, thanks for your question. I think it's quite obvious that the PPP model have more protection than the IPP. So I would think that the investor would, especially for investor, would prefer to go on the PPP scheme. However, of course, there was some issue with the PPP scheme. For example, it's more time consuming and it's more difficult to obtain. So those are the 2 points that the investor need to keep in mind.
Okay. Now turning to Matt, when you compare the crux of the two models, which is clearly the power purchase agreement, under the BOT you clearly have take or pay, you've got a long history of bankable deals in the coal industry already, so that's quite clearly project financeable. When you get to the sort of template EVN document, what are the risk strategies and mitigants you can use with that PPA to address the risk of not having a take or pay?
Yeah, I think the investor would have to rely on a high demand for power and for EVN to dispatch that project without having the clear take or pay obligation.
Okay, so Heike, given we might not be able to deal with the take or pay issue in Vietnam, can we then turn to the LNG procurement strategy and look at tools in the LNG master sale contracts and other procurement to try and deal with that take or pay risk?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nick. So having no take or pay in the LNG offtake is obviously not the preferred scenario for producers, as you can imagine, or for sellers, particularly those who have to service a loan still, and whose lenders have traditionally certainly insisted on long-term demand being secured by take or pay to underpin the debt. Producers could mitigate, I think, this lack of secure offtake by selling their LNG to portfolio traders or players, aggregators, as you called it, like Eni did with BP, and I know there are some BP people on the call. In the case of Coral LNG, that was done in this way. So those portfolio players then have, I think, many more tools available than the traditional producers have, including access to a shipping fleet, which some producers have, but certainly not the buyers. So that would allow them to mix and match their own supply from projects with that of other producers where they offtake, and those other producers could be in other geographical regions, and thereby I think all of this replaces what was in fashion for a while, namely LNG swaps. So these aggregators would then also have inherently available a certain volume flexibility, which is obviously ideal to satisfy seasonal swings in their buyer countries, for example. They can fall back on destination and supply source flexibility within their own portfolio, and then mix and match also long-term contracts for base load supply, which we would always recommend a buyer to have for security of supply, with shorter term and spot cargoes to top up supply if and when there's a spike, or just to actually be able to ride a low price wave which may regionally unfold. So these portfolio players very rarely have the need to service debts, so they can be much more accommodating in agreeing flexible terms, including price. And so offtake from different supply sources basically supports the need or the ability to offer a variety of price formulas and indexation. For example, a regional JKM and a Brent indexation to get, in different sets of contracts to get the best of both worlds, because the oil price may be down, but JKM may spike, and so if you basically have both of those in your mix, then perhaps you can mitigate that risk more. Of course, actually, we would always recommend, as we did in the episode 1, we would recommend a pass-through between LNG SPA and PPA of the main contract terms to the extent possible, like force majeure, termination, and default. And of course, to give extra flexibility, but also a certain amount of protection of supply security for buyers, is to try and get as much LNG or gas storage in country as possible. So those onshore terminals in Vietnam will have more flexibility in that respect than the FSRU.
Yeah. I guess the ultimate solution would be actually to have one of the LNG traders as an equity participant in the mix of the actual downstream as well.
Yes, that would be a good way forward. Yes.
Yeah. Matt, turning to you, given everything we've just been talking about with PPAs and LNG supply, how do you see the financing of LNG to power projects developing in Vietnam, based on your experience with coal?
Yeah, over the last few years, I mean, in particular before COVID, we were beginning to see a lot more acceptance of Vietnam risk amongst international lenders. And just as one example, last year, one of the power projects in Vietnam was able to refinance its debt partially with a notes issue. However, I think especially in the current environment for now, lenders are very risk adverse. And what we're seeing on the coal projects we're working on at the moment is they very much want to follow the existing precedents. So, I mean, I think at least initially, unless there's a large corporate sponsor guarantee, we'll be seeing traditional project finance structures, usually backed up with ECA involvement as well. I mean, going forward, as kind of the market becomes more liberal and banks become more accepting of Vietnam, we may see less traditional structures, but I think those are more likely to be refinancing options going further down the road.
Sure. Okay. Lynn, given everything we talked about, you've talked about the emergence of a truly merchant market with the IPPs. Where do you see that developing? What are the regulatory changes we need for that merchant market to develop?
Hi, yes. I think it's certainly in the idea of Iraq, which is the Electricity Regulatory Authority of Vietnam, to achieve that all energy should be subject to the merchant market, and that is what Iraq have asked the MOIT last month. However, I think MOIT still decided that for BOT project it's kind of exempted for now, and then just wait and see, how the IPP go forward. I think, with the strong demand, maybe the merchant market is not a disaster, because there's event always need power and they always need to dispatch. But of course, if you have the lender traditionally, like Matt said, they sort of want to see, the good precedent. You have a very strong PPA, you have a full commitment from event to kill power, to pay power, take and pay for power, take or pay for energy with a very fixed tariff throughout the 20 years. So that is traditionally, they still want to see this. I think it's still a bit early to see that whether all of the energy will be subject to merchant market, but it's only time can tell.
And what, I know it's a bit of a crystal ball, but looking to how that market might develop, if you look at other jurisdictions, the UK is a good example. The use of contracts for difference, the use of corporate PPAs have been used for those merchant markets. And I know, at least in the renewable space, particularly for solar, there is some of those corporate PPAs emerging in Vietnam. Do you see that as the way forward for the LNG to power market as well?
Yes, I still know that the contract for differences, there's only a kind of pilot scheme under draft decision proposed by Iraq to the Prime Minister. However, that decision has not been approved yet. It's subject to pending for approval by the Prime Minister. But in that pilot decision, it's only 400 megawatt to 1,000 megawatt of solar and wind to be subject to that scheme. So I think the government wants to see, how that works first before they can apply. So at the moment, the government has not discussed that the CFD would be applied to LNG, but I would not rule it out in the long term if the CFD for renewables work.
Okay, right. First question from the audience. This one's going to be for you, Heike. Can you briefly explain the procedure for buying LNG in a spot market?
Sure. So there is, well, I say there is a standard model. It's not quite true because a lot of the traders have their own standard model, but it follows the same kind of setup. It's called Master Sales and Trading Agreement, or MSPA. And so you would enter as a potential buyer with potentially as many sellers as you would like, and as you can get interest from one of those MSPAs, and that sets aside basically all the terms on which you agree generally. And then as and when you actually want to do a trade, then you can enter into, some people call it a confirmation notice, and that will set out the specifics of that trade. So there's no obligation just by signing the MSPA, but there would be the moment you sign a confirmation notice, and that will set out where the cargo comes from, the price, who the seller is, who the buyer is, where it's going, and more specific things like that, also quality restrictions and things. So there are quite a lot of these documents floating around in the market. And, if you want any more specific advice, we would be very happy to provide that.
Great. Okay, next question. It's also for you, Heike, and I'll help you with it. Can you explain the experience in the UK and other jurisdictions of LNG to power plants and how they join the market? Is there any special regulation for LNG in the power market in the UK and elsewhere?
Okay, so there are no LNG to power projects in the UK. Simply because we have a national transmission system. So any LNG onshore terminals, which we have 3 of, will basically provide their gas into that transmission system. And then a UK power producer would just take off the gas out of the system. They may have a direct contract with the toller through the LNG onshore terminal. So, as Lynn explained earlier, so there may be an owner of a terminal, and then there will be people who toll their LNG and gas through that, and they may have a direct agreement with the power plant, but it's generally not a specific dedicated project.
Yeah, and I guess the other point is because there are a lot of industrial users of gas outside of power, if you're bringing LNG into the UK market, your options for buyers are much deeper. And additionally, you've got the national balancing point as a trading point. So gas can be traded within the system. So
sure, sorry.
No, go ahead, Heike.
So we also have a lot of other gas supply, not only domestic, but also from Norway and from continental Europe. So that all gets put into the big mix, as you say, NBP, and taken off by the various off-takers and buyers.
Yeah, and I guess you've also got export out of the UK with some of the pipelines like Beckton, which can flow both ways.
Yes.
Which is actually probably a very neat way to move on to my next question for Lynn, which is...
sorry, can maybe it would be better if you can share a bit of experience for energy to power in Singapore to answer.
Yeah, so Singapore has an aggregator model. So the Singapore regulators appoint aggregators who bring LNG into Singapore on an aggregated basis. So Singapore gets its natural gas through pipeline gas, particularly from on the Western Natuna pipeline, and then LNG that's imported. The aggregators are appointed, so Pavilion and I think Shell is the other one, and then the power generators buy from them on the local market. So it's a relatively confined market in those terms. So in actual fact, you have you have different types of aggregators. So you have the trader aggregator sitting outside selling in, and then you have the domestic aggregator bringing the LNG in and then selling it to the local power stations as necessary. And there are some industrial users of gas as well. So nowhere near as deep as the UK market, but you have the benefit of that as well. So Lynn, the gas master plan that was published a couple of years ago talks about producing an upstream, a midstream, and a downstream. What do you know about the plans for building out the gas transmission and distribution system so that other users of gas as well as power can use gas, and potentially some of these FSRUs can be providing third-party access so that you can be delivering to multiple different buyers, not just particular power stations?
Actually, it's unlike the UK or Singapore. In Vietnam, each LNG power plants would have build their own gas pipeline. We don't have integrated national gas system. I think it will take time to build it up. So the power plants, if they are in the same power generation center, so they can build one gas pipeline to share among themselves, and then they can outsource from different source of fuel for energy. But they probably have to build their own gas pipeline. They can't rely on the national pipeline like you have in the UK or Singapore.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
I think we have some questions from the audience.
Yeah. I've done two of them, so we're on to the next one. This is a question about PPA. So could we explain how investors sell the electricity?
I think before that, sorry, Nick. Before that, I think Zhao has a follow-up questions on HICA. That how could power plant investor get take or pay in energy comparing to take or pay in LNG?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't see that. Yeah.
So if that is in respect of the UK, basically we haven't got any new gas-fired power stations. So it doesn't really apply because so the power plants will buy in the market, and I'm not sure there's take or pay in those contracts. I haven't done any of those. But there are no lenders involved, and so they wouldn't be looking to secure offtake via take or pay. And as we said, it's a liquid market, so there is a basically a virtual trading point within the UK system, and you can offtake as much gas as you need. And the transmission system operator ensures that there is enough gas supply coming in as well. So.
I think maybe the UK is a bit different for comparing with it, because it's a much more developed market. Mm-hmm. But maybe Haka, you will have experience in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, that more developing countries. So maybe you can share a little bit of those experience in the other countries that Vietnam can learn and follow, rather than very developed market, the UK.
Okay, well, it was in relation to the UK question, which is why I answered it.
So let's
example.
So in Pakistan, we worked on the project. The project I worked on was also a LNG to gas system, not to power. And I understand that the second project is off-taken by the power plants, but it's a tolling arrangement. So it's a fee being paid by the power plants, to the power plants being available. And to be honest, I have no visibility of how that is being structured in the country, and we haven't worked in Bangladesh. Do you know, Nick?
Okay, so I don't know the specifics of the Bangladesh, but I understand if you were to go for a back-to-back structure where you could pass through the LNG cost in the PPA to the off-takers,
of course, yeah.
you would match the LNG take or pay with the power take or pay, so that you would guarantee a flow of energy through. Failure to take electricity leading to a failure to take LNG would mean you would pass that through cost back to the power off taker.
And then, of course, you have the issue that you need to check whether you can get away in the market with such a high price. So that's always an issue.
Exactly. So, I mean, you could combine that with some pricing flexibility. So you wouldn't take as high a take or pay percentage. You maybe take a slightly lower one on the LNG, so that you had that pricing flexibility, so that you could mitigate price risk.
Sure, and that goes back to what we discussed earlier, right? That you mix and match long term and top up.
Exactly. Yeah. Matt, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just going to say that we've also seen with a couple of imported coal projects that you have the back-to-back take-or-pays that you discussed in the BOT PPA and the coal supply agreement. So that's already in the market in Vietnam.
Okay. All right, Heike, another one, this time on flexibility. Yeah. What is the highest level of flexibility in volume acceptable to a seller of LNG?
Well, that very much
up gas carry forward, right? Very
much depends on the producer, how willing they are. Qataris usually are not very willing, and it very much depends on whether they have still a loan to service. I guess the aggregators, the portfolio players, that was the word I was looking for, they probably have much more flexibility there, because they can sell it elsewhere if a buyer doesn't take it in the year, because that's obviously always the issue. Where does that LNG go if the buyer decides it doesn't want certain quantity which it wants to have its hands on but may not want to take? And so you have to have it available as a seller, but on the day it may not be taken, so you have to be quite quick on your feet in order to be able to sell it elsewhere. And I think that is probably at the moment the name of the game, but as I alluded to, a lot of people talk about the market flipping again, with demand becoming higher than supply, because a lot of the current projects are being delayed because of COVID and other things. And so then sellers may not be so willing. So to answer your questions, we've seen, anything from 70%. That may be in cases lower, but we've also seen still 80-85%. And as I said, sellers will normally resist.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the answer is actually you can be your own portfolio player by actually going to multiple different aggregators and
well, that becomes quite complex though.
I mean, but
you need to know what you're doing. I think
you need to know what you're doing. You have to have a contracting strategy and the team to back it up. But I guess you could create your own flexibility through through a trading approach to it by long term, medium term, and spot and short.
And so we have seen actually quite a lot of that being implemented by the Pakistanis. So PSO, which is the buyer in one of the cases in the project where we where we acted. So they have a lot of knowledge of buying petroleum and petroleum products. So they are much more versed in buying and riding the market to a certain extent. So definitely, if you have that experience, and then that's a good way forward.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I have a question from SJ about whether investor can sell electricity in the way of PPA and then merchant market at the same time if PPA is not enough for financing, maybe if 5 years later. I think the answer here is depend on whether it's a PPP or IPP. If it is a PPP, then it's hopefully not, because the PPA should be able to cover your financing. And then in your tariff proposal, you would already have the capacity charge that has taken into account all of your debt, all of the interest, principal in the year. It's very complex. So actually it's not necessary, but for IPP, then yes, it's possible to negotiate that with EVN. And then, you know, after the end of the term, you can sell to third parties, or after, you know, the end of the term, you can sell after 5 years. So it's IPP is more flexible in that way.
Yeah.
In terms of the financing, on day one, you would have to give a corporate guarantee if your PPA is not sufficient for all the financing, and then maybe in the future, when the merchant market becomes more established in Vietnam, you could look to refinance based on that. But at the moment, that's not a possibility.
And I guess there would be the possibility of some hedging options, and sort of non-traditional contract for difference. Not the power sector contract for difference, but in its wider sense, and using some of those tools probably outside of Vietnam to hedge your risk there.
Yeah, and I think that's right, although it would add an extra layer of complexity which could delay the project slightly.
Yeah, and cost. Yeah, so your financial model may end up underwater if you add too many bells and whistles. All right, well, that's probably the end of the Q&A for now. If you do have any questions, please do contact any one of us. Our contact details are at the beginning of the slides. They will be circulated to everyone that's registered. And once the video is ready, we'll circulate that as well. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to Lynn, Matt and Heike, and hope you can join us for episode 3, which will be scheduled shortly, and it will be either late September or early October. And that's our colleagues, Daisy East and Joe McGladdery. Thanks very much for your time.
Matt, I think maybe you want to follow up. Maybe Ms. Wang, she has another, I just saw the question after you close off.
Oh, but yeah, I mean, it's maybe one we can follow up with a bit later, but for ECAs are generally tied to a country. So depending on who your finances are and who your ECA contractors are, the ECA in that jurisdiction may be interested in working with you, but each ECA has its own particular requirements that have to be met, which it depends jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It's not something we can answer quite quickly here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe we follow up offline with that.
Sure.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Thank you,
Great.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Everybody.
Thank you. Bye.